Hey, welcome back for another lecture on the human species. Thanks so much for bearing with me with the delay on this lecture in particular. And thanks to the few people that reached out asking how I was doing. So far, I'm okay. I know we're all sort of concerned with COVID and things of that nature. I don't think it's COVID related, but I'll make sure to keep everybody posted. All right, so today we're going to focus on hormones and behavior, um, as well as some of the behavioral interactions that may occur between individuals within species or populations. And so, specifically, we'll talk about the biology of behavior, which includes things called neurotransmitters, hormones, and genes. And we'll also talk about how different behaviors may evolve, specifically things like selfishness, altruism, and so on, primarily through what's called kin selection and inclusive fitness. I want to mention that all the grades on Blackboard should be up to date and ready to go. There are a few questions on the exams that I got wrong. It happens occasionally just through writing the exam on Blackboard and trying to upload things. Every now and then I just get it wrong, clicking the wrong answer. But every now and then also, sometimes the answer gets changed if you change the number of options, and it's easy to forget that those things were modified. And so I edited the exam to correct those issues. So thanks to everybody for pointing those things out to me as well. Okay. So the question we might ask is, how do genes, hormones, and experience affect behavior? And so I'll present a simple kind of schematic for thinking about the biology of behavior. And we're going to use this framework throughout the rest of the lecture to think about why animals behave the way that they do. Okay, so first of all, some stimulus enters the body, right? Some sight or sound or smell enters the brain through our sensory organs, right? So our eyes, our ears, our nose, right? Depending on what the stimulus is. The millions of brain cells or neurons in your brain communicate to process and make sense of the stimulus. And so neurons or brain cells communicate through what are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are molecules that are made in the brain that signal from brain cell to brain cell, right? From neuron to neuron. And so neurons create an electrical impulse when they're active, and that's why we can monitor brain activity with electrodes using an EEG. So often the brain will send a signal through the nerves that run throughout the body to other organs and tissues. And some of these organs and tissues may produce hormones in response to those signals. And so hormones are made in glands and tissues and travel through the bloodstream to carry signals throughout the body, right, from organ to organ, so to speak. And so, for example, if some kind of stimulus that you see scares you or startles you, right, you're watching a scary movie or someone jumps out from behind a corner and scares you, your brain will send a signal to your adrenal glands. And those adrenal glands are located on the top of your kidneys, and they produce adrenaline. And so adrenaline is a hormone that travels through the bloodstream all over the body and has effects everywhere, including the brain. And so adrenaline affects things like heart rate. It increases heart rate, dilates the pupils, it increases blood sugar levels, and so on. And so you probably know that if you've ever been startled or scared, again, whether it's a jump scare in a movie or something happens suddenly that startles you, you know that feeling that you get, your adrenaline starts pumping, and that's what that is. It's a hormone. And so the combination of the neurotransmitter and hormone signaling determines the behavior in response to the stimulus. And so all of this stuff happens incredibly fast. And so a combination of factors affect these processes. In particular, they affect which hormones and neurotransmitters are made and how much are made in any given instance. And those things include genes, environment, and experience. And so one of the things that I want to highlight is that even though there are genetic bases for behaviors, for like simple behaviors, it doesn't mean necessarily that we are biological beings that are simply reacting to the genetics that we inherited from our biological parents, right? There are multiple factors that all interact, including, by the way, in humans, this idea of culture to determine behavioral outcomes. But in general, this is the kind of framework that we use to understand and explain the biology of behavior. And so let's go through different examples of genes, experience, and environment that influences behavior. And so here's a really kind of interesting and I don't know if it's funny, but it's in some sense somewhat comical that basically this is from a paper in a journal called PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, called Extraneous Factors in Judicial Decisions. And so judicial decisions refers to decisions that judges make in courts of law. And extraneous factors mean like factors outside of the setting of the legal system. So other factors not related to the legal system that affect the decisions that judges make. And the abstract says, we find that the percentage of favorable rulings, good rulings for the defendant, drops gradually from around 65% to nearly zero within each decision session and returns abruptly to 65% after a break. And so our findings suggest that judicial rulings can be swayed by extraneous variables that should have no bearing on legal decisions. And so this plot is from this paper, and on the y-axis it shows the proportion or the percentage of favorable decisions. And so basically, as judges get tired or hungry or annoyed or whatever it might be, the percentage of favorable decisions decreases. They take a break, and then the percentage of favorable decisions increases. Right? So this is an example of an external environmental factor influencing the behavior of an individual. How many people have been annoyed or angry when they get tired or hungry? Right? It's a fairly typical thing that most people experience. And this is just one example of that has particularly important implications for the lives of people, right? Because judges are making such important decisions. Okay, so that's an example of like an external environmental influence on behavior in humans. Okay, so hormones, remember, are chemical signals related to communication between organs and that travel through the bloodstream. And so hormones can influence multiple different behaviors. The hormone ghrelin is the, quote, hunger hormone, and its release makes you feel hungry. The hormone leptin is the quote, full hormone, and its release makes you feel full. And so researchers have done studies looking at these hormones in mice. And so in knockout mice without leptin receptors, they never can feel full. And that's simply because the leptin signaling doesn't work. And so they eat and eat and eat because the ghrelin hormone is telling them that they're hungry, you need to eat more food. And because the leptin signaling is experimentally modified, they just continue to eat. They continue to consume more calories, more energy. And because of an energy imbalance, they gain fat. And so, whereas in the non-experimentally induced leptin signaling mice, they would eat after some time of consuming food. The leptin hormone would be released, and they would feel full and stop eating. And so, hormones like leptin and ghrelin are the same things that we experience. They're the same things that influence how hungry we are and how full we feel around the timing of meals. And so there's like a whole field of study surrounding leptin and ghrelin and its influence on like BMI and obesity and things of that nature in humans. Estrogen is another hormone that affects normal social emotional behavior. Testosterone is another hormone that is related to things like competition, muscle, libido, aggression, and courtship. And so there's interesting research looking at athletes showing that testosterone rises in anticipation of the competition. It remains high during the competition, and then if you win, it increases even more, and if you lose, it decreases dramatically. And so these changes in testosterone in the winners versus the losers of like a sports match or competition or game or whatever it might be are strongly associated with mood. And so the higher the levels are, the better the mood is. And so, again, this is an example for soccer players. And it's this result or this pattern has been shown again and again in both men and women. In fact, this graph is from a study of a women's soccer team. And interestingly enough, other studies have shown that this change in testosterone and the so-called winner-loser effect is also observed in spectators, right? So when your team wins, testosterone goes up in the fan. When your team loses, testosterone goes down. And so that's quite fascinating, right? That's like another facet of anybody who is a sports fan. Go Eagles. Hopefully we have a football season. But I find that really fascinating. Okay. Cortisol is another hormone, and cortisol is the stress hormone. And the stress hormone affects a range of behaviors, including mating, eating, and reproduction. And so these are just some examples of that. And so when people talk about stress, it's somewhat, it's related, but it's distinct from so-called psychosocial stress, right? So let's say you have an exam for this course, or you're working on a lab report. You might be stressed out. You might be thinking, I don't know what's going to happen. Did I study hard enough? Are the Blackboard questions written properly? And things of that nature. And in response to those stressors, cortisol can be released. Interestingly enough, there's also research on cortisol levels in athletes. And so cortisol levels in the soccer study that I referenced went up for both teams on the day of the match. However, there's no winner-loser effect. In other words, both teams experienced stress on the match day, and whether they won or lost didn't determine their sort of like stress outcome. And so there are lots of things that can influence cortisol. Cortisol and many of these hormones fluctuate naturally during the day. And so, to my knowledge, one of the things that actually increases cortisol is caffeine. So actually, caffeine sort of makes you more stressed on a physiological level. And even though I know that, I still, enjoy caffeine and drink it almost every day. Okay, so those are hormones. Neurotransmitters, on the other hand, are chemical signals between brain cells, between neurons in the brain. And so they're, in addition to being found in the brain, they are found at the axon endings of motor neurons. And so motor neurons stimulate muscle fibers. And so dopamine, serotonin, and other neurotransmitters are released in the brain in response to a variety of factors, including food, sex, and so on. And so dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a role in rewarding motivated behavior. Serotonin is released in response to positive events. And so serotonin, like dopamine, is kind of functions as a reward. It's a reward signal that makes you happier. And interestingly enough, serotonin is found in all animals. And so here's an example of a worm that has a serotonin release in response to finding food. Right? So if we eat something particularly tasty or high calorie or full of sugar or whatever it might be, we frequently get a hit of these neurotransmitters as a sort of reward. And you can imagine that it sort of makes sense that finding or discovering a high calorie food would provide a psychological and physiological reward to promote the additional or future sort of finding or discovery of food. That makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So genes shape the pathways and degree of responsiveness in the system and can therefore shape behavior. And so that's why behavior can evolve. Antidepressant drugs increase the effect of serotonin in the brain. And this is just one example of those. Okay. Another example is AEA, or anandamide, which is known as the, quote, bliss molecule that's associated with the runner's high. So interestingly, in both humans and dogs, both of these species are two species evolved for high activity levels. The brain releases this neurotransmitter after running. And it turns out that this is what's called an endocannabinoid and has a similar chemical structure as in marijuana. And so marijuana works because it hijacks this pathway. And so ferrets, here's another example of a different species, don't experience much of an increase in this neurotransmitter after running, whereas both humans and dogs do. Neurotransmitters can influence maternal behavior and bonding. And one example of this is oxytocin, which is the so-called cuddle chemical. It's been reported that oxytocin is released in the brain around the time of childbirth. And so we can see that a range of these neurotransmitters have really profound and strong effects on our mood and our behavior. It's not just for humans, it's for all animals. Okay, so how do these things evolve? How does behavior evolve then in the context of hormones and neurotransmitters? Okay, so we went over this study earlier in the course, and so think back to it. Here the purpose is to drive home the mechanism. In the 1950s, there was an experiment in Russia involving the breeding of foxes. This is a classic study in behavioral evolution. And so in the 50s, they began this sort of decades-long effort to breed a population of tame foxes. And so they hoped to show essentially that physical and morphological changes in domestic animals like dogs could have resulted from selection for a single behavioral trait, which in this case was friendliness toward people. And so essentially what happened was they started with a population of wild foxes. They tested the reaction of those wild foxes to humans. And some of the foxes naturally were more aggressive toward humans, and others were more cautious or friendly. And so what they did was they didn't breed the aggressive ones, and so their evolutionary fitness decreased. Right? They didn't pass on their potentially aggressive. They didn't pass on their genes related to increased aggression. Whereas they bred the cautious or friendly foxes, which positively influenced their evolutionary fitness. And so the cautious and friendly foxes were able to pass on their genes to offspring. And so within the initial population of wild foxes, in this case, there was normal variation in the pathways associated with these different responses. And the variation in those pathways are shaped by genes. So in other words, there's a link between genes that each individual inherits from mom and dad, the particular hormonal and neurotransmitters associated with different behaviors, and finally, the actual behavior that's observed in life. And so we found out that after many generations of this experiment, we ended up with friendly foxes. And so foxes in this new domesticated population are interesting. They're different from the initial parent population because they seek out human contact, and they're very dog-like, right? They like lick the experimenters' hands and faces, and this friendly behavior is apparently evident before the young foxes are a month old. So it's a thing that's based in genetics. That's easily observable in young individuals. And so what we found is that this new domesticated fox population showed an unusually high number or incidence of other changes, including having like floppy ears, shortened tails that were curled up upward like a dog's, and numerous other phenotypes. And so basically what happened is selecting for friendliness, selecting for the pathways and genes associated with friendliness towards humans through pleiotropy and integration led to numerous other changes in the foxes. And so researchers at Duke University, including Brian Hare, as well as researchers from Harvard, including Richard Wrangham and David Pilbeam, have suggested that a similar self-domestication process has occurred in recent human evolution, where more aggressive individuals were penalized or ostracized by the social group, and therefore had lower evolutionary fitness. And so if so, this would select for friendlier humans, friendlier people. And if you think about it, people actually are incredibly friendly compared to other primates. Think about all the things that we do that are just inherently friendly compared to what we see with like chimpanzees or other primates, right? We happily sit in crowded rooms with strangers, right? Of course, not accounting for social distancing and things of that nature. We collectively forage for food with strangers. We're generally nice to people we don't know. And all of this is very friendly and odd compared to what we see with other primates, and indeed most other animal species. Now, keep in mind, when we say friendly, we don't necessarily mean that, we're going to become social best friends. It simply means that when we encounter other humans, our tendency is not to harm them, right? Our tendency is to be cordial, is to be friendly. Now, when we get into questions of like civilizations and political systems and capitalism and things of that nature, then we're getting into something else that is really just like sort of a it's is distinct from looking at things on the individual level. So we're not talking about like countries and histories of warfare and things of that nature. We're just talking about like person to person, small population to small population interaction. Okay. So there are other examples of the influence of genes on behavior. And so this is another classic study in behavioral evolution. Basically, what happened was researchers interbred two closely related species of mice to investigate the genetics of den construction behavior. And so these two different species differ in the kinds of dens they created. So one species would create a short, simple den, whereas the other species would create a long, complex den with an escape tunnel. And so in the experiment, there was a breeding of different genotype combinations. And after those breeding events, they observed the behavior of the offspring. And so this is an example of different combinations. And what they found was that escape tunnel building in the longer, more complex dens is a simple Mendelian trait. They also found that the alleles to build the tunnels are dominant. And so the mice who are heterozygous, who had at least one set of genes from the tunnel building species, always built tunnels. In populations with a quarter of the genes from the tunnel builders, only half, or the heterozygous ones, built escape tunnels. The homozygous non-escape tunnel builders didn't build escape tunnels at all. And so this highlights another behavior that's tied to the genetics of a species. The researchers in this study were actually able to map this behavior, this tunnel building and tunnel length behavior to genes at three particular locations in the genome. Right, so 3 different positions at chromosome 1, 2, and 20. Right, it's fairly interesting here. And so, in other words, the tunnel length building behavior of these populations was predicted by the genotype of the individual. Okay, here's another example of the relationship between genes and behavior. And so a lot of people who look at biology and evolution tend to focus on certain species that are, let's say, easier to study. So the rodent group is one such group. A lot of people study mice. A lot of other people study flies or Drosophila. And that's because they're able to do evolutionary experiments due to the fact that they reproduce quickly and they live short lives. Primates, and especially humans, are bad for these kinds of experiments, ethical considerations aside, simply because we have different life histories. Primates are long-lived species that have few offspring. So this is an example of a study looking at the relationship between genes and behavior in fruit flies. And so fruit fly larvae show different patterns of foraging behavior when searching for food. So one group or one variation is the rover. And rovers show longer foraging trails on food and have a greater tendency to leave a patch of food than sitters do. And so this behavioral difference is naturally preserved in the population. And research on the genetics of Drosophila, of the fruit fly, showed that variation in a single gene, which they've creatively called foraging, or FOR, that the rover allele for which is genetically dominant to the sitter allele. And so both forager types, given the bimodal distribution of foraging types in Drosophila, could be maintained by natural selection. And so research suggests that perhaps the rover allele or rover alleles are selected for in crowded larval environments, whereas the sitters are favored in less crowded ones. And so that's sort of supported by the fact that the difference between this behavioral difference in foraging length between the two types of fruit flies are not observed in the absence of food, right? We only see this difference between rovers and sitters when food is around. Okay, here's another example of the relationship between genes and behavior. And this is the relationship between something called vasopressin and social and mating system. So like a monogamous species would have a mating system where one biological male and one biological female sort of pair up as a mating couple. Whereas in polygamous species, you can have different combinations. You can have multiple males mating with multiple females. You could have one male mating with multiple females, or you could have one female mating with multiple males. And that's polygamy, right? Poly is like multiple, whereas mono is a single or one. So vasopressin is a hormone, and it's thought to play an important role in social behavior, in sexual motivation, and pair bonding, which we would see in like a monogamous species, as well as playing a role in maternal responses to stress. And so here we have these two different species. You have the prairie vole and the meadow vole. One is monogamous and has high vasopressin receptor density, whereas the other one is polygamous and has low vasopressin receptor density. So the monogamous species, in other words, are better able to receive the vasopressin hormonal signal, which again we think is related to pair bonding. So interestingly, when the receptor density is experimentally increased for this hormone, this group, this meadow vole group or species, becomes more monogamous. And so the social and mating behavior of species is ultimately connected in some manner to the physiology of individuals. And so you might be wondering, like, does this also apply to humans? Well, there's some evidence that it does, actually. This is a paper from a few years ago looking at the relationship between genetic variation in vasopressin receptors and its association with pair bonding or monogamy in humans. So yes, it seems to have a similar effect in us as well. Okay, so remember that hormones are chemical signals between organs, and these hormones travel through the bloodstream. We've gone through several examples of different hormones and the sort of behavioral effect that they have. Again, not just in humans, but in all animals. And so leptin is one, again, that's associated with feeling full. And typically, individuals experience increases in leptin in response to eating. Ghrelin, on the other hand, is the hunger hormone. And this is released in response to being hungry. Estrogen affects normal social emotional behavior. Testosterone influences and is related to competition, libido, aggression, and courtship. And finally, cortisol is the stress hormone. Okay, neurotransmitters are chemical signals between neurons or between brain cells in the brain. AEA, or anandamide, is the so-called bliss molecule, which is released after high levels of physical activity in humans and also dogs. This is the neurotransmitter associated with the runner's high that some of you may have experienced. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter that's released in response to positive events and functions as a reward signal. Oxytocin is the cuddle molecule, and it's released in response to maternal behavior and bonding. Genes are the things that shape the pathways that stimuli, neurotransmitters, and hormones use to influence behavior. And so one example that we used in large-bodied mammals is the Belyaev-Fox experiment, where the alleles for friendlier behavior in foxes were favored. And so, in other words, in this study, in this experiment, the individuals with the alleles that build the brain and neurotransmitter or hormonal control of behavior to be more friendly were favored. They had higher fitness. We talked about the example of den construction in mice, and we learned that genes influence the type and the length of the escape tunnels that deer mice built. We talked about a gene that influences movement, right? The rovers and the sitters and the fruit flies. And finally, we talked about vasopressin receptor genes that affects pair bonding behavior in the social and mating systems of voles, right? Whether they were more monogamous or more polygamous. Okay, so before we move on to other aspects of behavior and sort of the more evolutionary side of things, I just want to mention that, again, behavior is a complex phenotype that is the result of many sort of simultaneously acting factors. Again, it's not just that individuals are shaped by the genes that they have, right? It's a combination of genes, the hormonal and neurotransmitter pathways associated with behaviors. It's related to the experience of individuals and the development of those individuals in a variety of environments throughout their growth and development. In humans, it's related to culture. In some non-human primates, it's related to culture in various forms, right? So again, even though that there's a genetic and biological basis for behavior, I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression that behavior is totally and completely determined by biology, which is not the case. Behavior is a complex outcome of both biological and cultural factors. Okay. So let's talk about behavioral interactions between individuals. Some of this could be considered a branch of a field called evolutionary psychology. I just want to caution you that evolutionary psychology as a field, even though we can sort of think about the evolution of behavior in this context, some of these things are difficult to test. A lot of hypotheses in evolutionary psychology are difficult to test. I'm only mentioning this because the things that we'll discuss here fall under the umbrella of anthropology, primatology, ecology, and evolutionary psychology. So, okay, we can think about costs and benefits of certain behaviors in an evolutionary context, in a context of natural selection. Okay, so selfishness is a behavior that benefits you, has a positive benefit for you, and a negative benefit for another individual. Cooperation has a positive benefit for you and a positive benefit for the other individual. Altruism is any behavior of an animal that benefits another individual, often at its own expense. Right? So it's some behavior that benefits another individual, but has some cost to you. And so it turns out that altruism essentially makes you more cooperative. There are two major mechanisms to explain altruism in animals. The first is something called kin selection. And kin refers to like related individuals. Kin selection is natural selection in favor of behavior by individuals that may decrease their chance of survival, but increases that of their kin. And I'll talk about how this works in just a moment. The other mechanism to explain altruism is something called group selection. Group selection is natural selection in favor of behavior by individuals that may decrease their chance of survival. Right? Again, there's a negative consequence to you, but increases the chance of survival of their group, which in this case would be made up of non-kin. And so the idea is that groups with more altruistic individuals would outcompete groups with fewer altruistic individuals, regardless of relatedness, regardless of like how much of your genes you share with other individuals. Group selection is a much more controversial explanation for altruism. And so we'll focus more heavily on kin selection to explain altruism. Spite is a social behavior that has a negative impact on both you and another. And so interestingly, we see this occasionally in humans. We see both altruism and spite, of course, in addition to cooperation and selfishness. But spite could be favored when it leads to an indirect benefit to some third party that's related to either of you. Okay, so let's explain what kin selection is and how and why we think kin selection could explain the presence of altruism in animals. Okay, so kin selection, again, is natural selection that acts on traits that affect something called inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness. Think back to evolutionary theory and remember that fitness refers basically to like one's evolutionary success, right? The number of offspring an individual has that survive to reproductive age, right? If you pass on your genes to more individuals that are healthy and survive, then you have higher fitness than another individual who doesn't have as many healthy and surviving offspring. Inclusive fitness, however, refers to the genes that you pass on plus the genes that you pass on through your relatives. And that's because they share some of your genes. Okay, but what does that mean still? Okay, so imagine that you, with your entire genome, all of your DNA, in each of the nuclear cells in your body, and half of your DNA in each sex cell, imagine that you have 4 offspring. Well, because each offspring gets 50% of their genetics from mom and 50% of their genetics from dad, it means that each offspring shares 50% of your genes, right? Each child has half of your genes, 50% of your genes. You're passing on 50% of your genes. And so if, in this case, if there are 4 offspring and we add up 0.5 plus 0.5 plus 0.5 plus 0.5, that would be the direct fitness that you possess from having those 4 kids. And so your direct fitness in this case would be 2.0. In other words, you passed on 2 full copies of your genes through those 4 kids. Okay, now imagine this scenario where you've got a brother or sister, a full brother or sister, you share the same biological parents. Well, this sibling, this brother or sister that you have, also shares 50% of your genes. Again, because you both got 50% of your genes from your mother and your father. Imagine if that brother or sister had kids of their own, and you had 3 nieces or nephews. Because each of those nieces and nephews gets half of their genes from mom and half of their genes from dad, just like all of these individuals, each individual niece or nephew has 0.25% of your genes. So in other words, you are more closely related to your sibling and your offspring than you are to your niece or your nephew. You share more genetics in common with your sibling and with your offspring. So in this case, if your brother or your sister had 3 kids, if you add up 0.25 plus 0.25 plus 0.25, your indirect fitness would be 0.75. In other words, you've passed on 0.75 of your genes, or allow me to rephrase it, 0.75% of your genes were passed on indirectly through a relative, right? Through your sibling, indirectly. You didn't pass it on directly by having your own kids. That's separate from the genes that you pass on through your own kids. Okay, so we have direct fitness. That's usually the one that we think about when we're talking about like evolutionary fitness. And we have indirect fitness through the fitness that you appreciate or take advantage of through the fact that you share genes with your relatives. Okay, so what if helping raise those 3 nieces and nephews costs you an offspring? Why would it cost you an offspring? Well, that's because those nieces and nephews require resources, and resources within a population like food is not unlimited. And so if you're helping to raise 3 nieces and nephews, there's not as much food to go around to feed your own offspring. There's not enough time and attention to pay to your own offspring. So if we are in this position where it costs 1 offspring to raise 3 nieces or nephews, under the logic of kin selection, that would be favored, because helping a sibling raise those 3 nieces or nephews means that your fitness through inclusive fitness is 2.25. Remember that each of these offspring are 0.5, right? So 3 of these offspring, 0.5 plus 0.5 plus 0.5, would add up to 1.5 because it cost an offspring. So 1.5 plus 0.75 is 2.25, right? It's the direct plus indirect fitness equals your inclusive fitness. And if that inclusive fitness in this case is greater than 2.0, which is what it would have been if you simply had 4 offspring of your own, this would be the evolutionarily optimal outcome. And this contributes to an explanation of why we might help other individuals that we're related to, even though it cost us in terms of our direct fitness. That's because the net outcome, the ultimate outcome, is actually a beneficial one. Right? So in other words, if we go back to our understanding of altruism, right, there's a negative, there's a cost to you, but a benefit to another individual. If that other individual is a close relative of yours, however, because you share genes that you both inherited from your family, through kin selection, those behaviors might be favored. In other words, kin selection favors altruistic behaviors because it, while decreasing or while costing the actor in some sense, it has a net positive benefit for the inclusive fitness of you. So kin selection explains the appearance of altruism in animals. Even though it looks like at face value, an altruistic behavior is one that benefits another individual and costs you, it costs you a smaller amount in the moment, but gains you a larger increase in fitness in the end. So really, it's not truly altruistic. It ultimately is beneficial to you, but just on a larger scale of inclusive fitness. Okay, let's jump back ahead. Okay, so there are examples of altruistic behaviors in different animal species. In particular, in eusocial species, like ants, naked mole rats, or bees and wasps. And so in these cases, the worker animals, the worker individuals, do not reproduce, right? Their direct fitness is 0. Only the queen reproduces. But through the mechanism of something like kin selection, these sort of helper behaviors can evolve. There's another example of, quote, helpers at the nest, like in birds, where an offspring helps at the nest even after it reaches maturity. And again, that's because it's increasing its own fitness because it shares genes in common with its sibling. There's been interesting studies looking at the relationship between altruism or certain kinds of behaviors and the degree to which two individuals are related. And so it turns out the more closely related individuals are, the more sort of altruistic they tend to be. And that aligns with the predictions of kin selection. Okay. Now humans are a really interesting case because humans have two things that sort of differ from our close relatives. One is that we tend to live much longer. And so because we live much longer, in humans, biological females experience menopause, right? Biological females have the potential for a long post-reproductive life where they're living for some time, for possibly decades, without having additional offspring. And one hypothesis that explains the existence of long lifespans and menopause in humans is the grandmothering or grandmother hypothesis. And the idea is that the long lifespan of grandmothers allows them to contribute to raising their grandchildren. And it's been suggested that when a grandmother is present, newborns have a much greater chance of surviving into the first several years of their life versus when the grandmother's absent. And so we'll get into more of the details here in a future lecture. The idea is that the humans have a different life history pattern compared to other non-human primates. This different life history pattern is probably linked to many of the things that we identify as being uniquely human. And so, like I said, we'll get into that in more detail soon. Okay. So I mentioned that If individuals tend to be more related to one another, more closely related, there's a greater willingness to engage in behaviors that cost the actor for the benefit of the recipient. And Hamilton's rule is this equation. You can think of it really as an idea. You don't have to think of it quantitatively. You can think of it in a qualitative sense. Hamilton's rule helps us. It allows us to make a prediction about the chance or the likelihood of a certain behavior occurring in the context of altruism and kin selection. You can think of it, in terms of like, what is the cost suffered by the donor in any behavioral interaction while undertaking some altruistic behavior. So genes, under Hamilton's rule, genes should increase in frequency when R times B is greater than C. This means greater than, that these numbers, whatever this product is greater than C, whatever that number is. So R is relatedness between individuals, between an actor and a recipient, or a donor and a recipient. And B is the reproductive benefit to the recipient. Whereas C is the reproductive cost to the giver. So in other words, when the benefit to the recipient multiplied by the relatedness between individuals, when that number is greater than the cost to the giver, we would expect those alleles, we would expect those behaviors to evolve. So in other words, altruism can evolve in a population if a potential donor can more than make up for losing C offspring, when they can make up for the loss of direct fitness by adding to the population offspring bearing a fraction of its genes. And so it all sort of works out, the maths all works out. Kin selection is the most sort of powerful explanation for altruistic behaviors among related individuals, right? Individual A helps individual B at the cost to individual A, but the benefit of individual B. And through the benefits to individual A in terms of inclusive fitness, those altruistic behaviors might be expected to evolve. Okay, so that makes sense in the context of individuals that are related. They share genes, they share fitness outcomes. So what about altruistic behaviors among individuals that are not closely related? In other words, why would unrelated individuals help each other out if that's how we're explaining altruism? Well, in general, cooperation among animals frequently involves kin. It frequently involves related individuals. And it's much more unlikely to be highly developed in groups of unrelated individuals. We can explain altruistic behaviors among unrelated individuals through something called reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's the idea. So it's a cooperative behavior where individual A does something beneficial for B, and through memory and social interaction, individual B later pays that individual back in some way that makes it worth it for individual A. And so this is an example, the photos show an example of grooming behaviors among macaques that live in Japan. And they live in cold environments, and as a result, they hang out in these natural hot springs. And so unrelated individuals will perform an altruistic behavior. They'll do a favor for another individual. They'll groom them. They'll check them for parasites and bugs and things of that nature. If it means that later on, that individual will pay them back. So among related individuals who you share genes with, we can explain altruistic behaviors through kin selection and inclusive fitness benefits. Through, altruism among non-related individuals can be explained through a system of reciprocity, reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That kind of thing. Okay, so we might be curious about whether or not altruism in a species is innate or not. Is an altruistic behavior something that you're born with, or is it something that you learn through interactions? We would imagine that if there's an evolutionary basis for altruism, in particular through altruism among related individuals, that it would be an evolved sort of quasi-innate thing. And so this is an example of one particular study looking at a kind of altruistic behavior in chimpanzees and humans. And the way it works is that an experimenter drops an object and needs help to get it back, to retrieve it. And so this protocol was repeated among chimpanzees, and then separately repeated among kids, among humans. And so this is the results of this study, where experimenter would drop something and then reach for it, right? But they can't quite reach it. The darker bars are humans, and the lighter bars are chimpanzees, right? So these are humans, these are chimpanzees. And what we see is that when there's a reward, right, when there's a benefit for the chimpanzee or the human to help you pick up the thing you dropped, there's not a huge difference between humans and chimps. In other words, chimpanzees will cooperate with other individuals when there's a benefit for them. Yeah, I'll help you because if I help you pick up this thing, you'll give me a piece of candy or fruit or whatever it might be. However, when there's no reward for helping for helping other individuals, chimpanzees are far less likely to cooperate, whereas humans are. So for humans, whether there's a reward or not, in the context of somebody dropping an object and reaching for it, they tend to help them get the object. Whereas in chimpanzees, they're much more likely to help them if there's something in it for them immediately, if there's an immediate reward. So here are the results for the same protocol where the experimenter drops something, but this time they don't reach for it. They drop something and they just sort of sit there. And what we see is that both humans and chimpanzees are less likely then to help because it's less obvious, perhaps, that the experimenter needs help. But when they do so at similar frequencies when there's a reward, right? So similar kind of pattern. Humans and chimps are not that different when a reward is involved, whether it be the experimenter reaching or not reaching. However, interestingly enough, the difference is much more dramatic between humans and chimpanzees when there's no reward and the experimenter's not reaching. So in other words, humans are much more likely to help the individual pick up the thing they dropped, even when there's no reward and they're not even trying to retrieve the item. So humans are, according to this study, more cooperative and more altruistic than chimpanzees. And so it's considered an altruistic behavior in this case because there's no reward, right? It costs the kid a few seconds of effort to help the experimenter pick up a thing. This still doesn't necessarily answer the question about whether this behavior is something innate or whether it's something that kids learn. But it's clear that humans and primates in general, but especially humans, are particularly good at learning, especially at a young age. And so humans basically, throughout the growth and development, are sponges, right, soaking things up. But in general, again, humans are more cooperative and altruistic than chimpanzees appear to be. Okay. So these kinds of behaviors are, again, it's not just like humans are a sort of readout of their genes, right? Everything is not attributable to nature, right? It's not attributable to the alleles that each individual has. There's also a cultural or environmental component that we might refer to as nurture. So this is an example of a behavioral outcome observed in humans that is likely dramatically influenced by cultural norms. That's not influenced by genetics necessarily. It's influenced mostly by environment. And this is an example of something called the ultimatum game. The ultimatum game is an economics idea, an economics exercise that's been studied cross-culturally, right? It's been studied in different human populations around the world. And so the idea is that you've got one player who is the proposer, and that individual is given some amount of money. And their job is to split that money with another player. And that player is the responder. And so once that proposer communicates their decision, the responder has the option to accept or reject. If the responder accepts, then the money is split according to the original proposal. However, if the responder rejects, both players received nothing. And that outcome, a rejection of the proposal, is considered a spiteful sort of behavior because no individual is getting anything. Right? There's a cost both to you and the other individual. And so it works like this. Let's say that I'm given $100, and it's up to me to decide between me and you how much money I get and how much money you get of that $100. And so we might say, hey, let's split it 50-50. I'll get $50, you get $50. After that proposal, you have the option, the ability to accept it or reject it. If you accept, we both get $50. If you reject, we both get nothing. I could say, hey, you know what? I was offered the $100. I'm going to take $75, and I'll give you $25. Or you know what? I'm going to take $95, and I'll give you $5. You might say, well, screw you. If you're giving me $5, then I don't want either of us to get it. And so what people have done is they've looked at this question in different parts of the world, in different human populations, and they've asked the question, like, what is a fair proposal? And so this figure is showing what's called the IMO, or the income maximizing offer for different populations around the world. And the IMO is a kind of measure of the population's willingness to punish inequitable offers. In other words, it's the offer that an income maximizing proposer would make if he or she knew the probability of rejection for each of the possible offer amounts. And so, in other words, in the US, the IMO is estimated to be something like 50%. Right? It's the offer of 50% that I might make if I knew the probability of rejection for each of the possible offer amounts. In other words, if I, as the proposer, wanted to actually walk away with money at the end, in the United States, I know that I have to offer you a fair split. I have to offer you 50% because we have cultural ideas surrounding like what is fair in this context. But other cultures, other societies around the world don't necessarily have the same expectation. These populations, for example, know that they can offer a much lower amount because they know that the likelihood for rejection is much smaller. So the point is, like, a behavior like spite, where there's a cost to both you and the other individual is not something that is necessarily determined by biology or genetics, but is instead shaped by cultural factors. And that fact sort of underscores the main point that although there is a significant biological basis to behavior, not all behavior can be explained by a gene or an allele, right? There's both cultural and biological factors at play. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the third and final lab for the course. I simply want to introduce the concept of the lab. It's related to what's called life history. I mentioned life history once in this lecture in the context of the grandmothering hypothesis for humans. So what is life history? Life history refers to all the things that happens to an organism during its lifetime. And this includes multiple different things like how large an individual is at the time of birth, what their growth pattern is, what is their age at first reproduction, what is their maximum lifespan, and so on. And all of these factors are kind of like correlated and related to one another. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, our species, is one that has a particular life history profile that differs from our close relatives. And so one of the things I mentioned before is that we have a very long lifespan compared to chimpanzees and gorillas, even though they also live reasonably long. But they're not living to be 100 years old or 115 years old in the best cases. Different species may have different ages at first reproduction. It depends on basically whether a species is optimized to have a slow life history or have a really fast life history. And I'll talk about the comparison and the contrast between those two sort of broadly different life history strategies among animals. Okay, so in this lab, we will develop hypotheses about different life history variables and what are called encephalization quotients in fossil hominins. Encephalization quotients, or EQs, are measures of relative brain size. Measures of relative brain size that take into account the overall size of the body. And so what we're going to do is we're going to estimate the body size of extinct fossil hominin species based on cranial measurements, based on measurements taken on the skulls of fossil hominins. So in other words, if we know the relationship in living species of different cranial measurements and the overall body mass of that individual, we can predict the unknown body mass of a fossil hominin based on its cranial measurements. We know from observations of living animals that body mass is a major predictor. It's significantly correlated with life history variables and expected brain size. So in other words, we can, through the study of fossil hominins, we can make predictions about their paleobiology. We can make predictions about their life history. And so that's what we'll do in the third and final lab. So next time I'll talk a little bit in more detail about how this will work. It's going to be another Microsoft Excel exercise where I will provide you access with different measurements of fossil hominin skulls or crania, and then you'll use those measurements to make predictions about body size and brain size and life history in fossil hominins. So that's it. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks again for your patience. The shift to online learning is not an easy one, both for you, but also for us as well. So I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.